So now, to kick off our first panel of the day, I'm happy to welcome to the stage NCL Vice President John Breyault, who has convened a distinguished group of experts to discuss how scammers are using AI today to defraud consumers. Take it away, John.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our event today, braving the terrible weather we had last night. Fortunately, it cleared up a little bit, so I'm glad to see so many faces I know and folks who are new to NCL and to the work we do. Welcome, and I hope you get a ton out of our event today. I'm going to go ahead and invite our first panel on to the stage right now. We titled this panel, How the Scammers Are Using AI. And I think what you'll find in talking to the folks we've assembled today is that they're all tremendous experts on this issue, and we really saw this panel today as a level set. I think we recognize that there is a lot of expertise in Washington, and there's a lot of folks who have questions as well about, well, wait a minute, I've heard about scammers using AI, I'm not really sure how it's happening. So we thought bringing in folks who've ever actually taken a look at how it's being used to help level set our conversations throughout the day would be a great way to kick off the day. So I'm really thankful to have friends and colleagues here share the stage with me. First, to my left, we have Grace Gedye. She's a policy analyst at Consumer Reports magazine, where she focuses on artificial intelligence and related issues, including algorithmic bias, accuracy, safety, and consumer protection. Next to her, Lana Swartz is an associate professor of media studies and a Shannon mid-career fellow at the University of Virginia. Go Wahoos. As a proud Virginian, I am legally obligated to say that every time we talk about Mr. Jefferson's University.
George Washington's University.
Yeah, exactly. And then next to Lana, we have my good friend Ben Winters. He is the director, of, sorry, my pages. He is the director of AI and privacy at the Consumer Federation of America. CFA has been around since the 1970s. I'm proud to say NCL was a founding member of CFA. Ben has not been there since the 1970s, but they've all written tremendous papers on this topic. If you haven't had a chance to, Ben is the author of a great paper called Scamplified: How Unregulated AI Continues to Help Facilitate the Rise in Scams. Lana is the author with the Data Society of Scam GPT, Gen AI and the Automation of Fraud, and Grace has written an amazing paper on AI voice cloning, looking at 6 companies and whether they're doing enough to prevent misuse of that technology. So thank you all for making the time today. Lana, thanks for making the trip up from Charlottesville. I appreciate it. Let's start off. I'm going to ask you just maybe briefly tell folks who haven't had a chance to read your papers yet. What is the takeaways from your paper that you'd like folks who haven't read it to take away from today's conversation before we dive into our questions? Grace, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and thank you so much for having us here today. This is I think a great topic. There are so many. There are AI harms in the news all the time, but I do think scams are one of the things that are affecting everyday Americans already. So at Consumer Reports, and I should just clarify, I don't work on the magazine side. I work on consumer protection advocacy, and there's a bit of a firewall there. I was really interested in voice cloning applications because there was such a clear use case for impersonation scams. And so what we did is we chose 6 direct-to-consumer AI voice cloning applications, so applications that anyone can use, you don't need to be a business, and tested them for how easy it was to create a non-consensual voice clone. So we took publicly available audio of a CR employee, audio that was already online from a podcast appearance, and used these 6 applications to make a voice clone using that publicly available audio and saw what safeguards they had. For 4 of the applications, there were no technical safeguards to frustrate non-consensual voice cloning. You just had to check a box saying they had the legal permission to make the clone of that voice. And then 2 other companies had some actually interesting efforts, requiring you to record novel audio and have that be the basis of the voice clone, including a script that the speaker likely hadn't said previously. And I actually think that spread was really interesting because it illustrated that there are viable business models that have these safeguards in place, and yet some industry leaders are choosing not to go that route. So we did that sort of evaluation. We were looking at the privacy practices as well of these companies, what they say they're doing with, the data that you offer when you ask them an application to clone your own voice, what sort of data they're collecting about their clients. The banking industry, for example, has a lot of know your customer practices. What were they doing to make sure they knew who their customers were, given the likelihood that they'd be used for scams? In many cases, it was enter a name and an email. And then we also looked at, what might the applicability be of Section 5 of the FTC Act and kind of existing consumer protection laws to AI voice cloning companies that are not doing a whole lot to safeguard their products from scams.
Great, thanks, Grace. And Lana, Scam GPT, I love the title. And I think I actually read that there are sort of GPTs now being sold in the dark web with names like Fraud GPT and all kinds of like GPTs at the end. Tell us a little bit about your paper, And to be clear, your paper is not telling people, on the dark web how to do what they do.
No,
But
no.
can you tell us a little bit about your paper, please?
Yeah, so my report with Data and Society was co-authored by Alice Marwick, who is an expert in misinformation, privacy, AI policy more generally, and a small known fact that her first book is on micro-celebrity. And my background looks at cryptocurrency, rapidly changing financial technologies, and how people kind of are increasingly dealing with a complex online economic and financial decision set. So she and I had been trying to figure out a good way to bring our two research interests and areas of expertise together. And we both found ourselves constantly texting back and forth about AI and scams. So we decided to, that it was a good use of our time to really spend some time systematically looking at the landscape. So our report attempts to offer a landscape of what is known and what is not known about this area from the perspective of two people who mostly study sort of online cultures and technologies. So one of the things we really endeavor to do is to show that while AI is really like pouring kerosene on the situation, at the same time, it's the existing situation of, economic uncertainty, lack of trust in institutions, lack of accountability for platforms, rapidly changing economic norms and expectations and practices is a huge part of what undergirds this kind of coming crisis. When in a world where everything seems risky and risk makes sense, then sort of nothing seems risky. And we suggest that that's a huge problem driving the and then at the same time we're getting fraud at scale, right? So this intersection is a really challenging moment that we're trying to rise to. One of the things we do in our report is we try to identify unanswered questions that we think can be answered by researchers such as ourselves who try to understand this space and not kind of like rush to decision making.
Great. And Ben, Scamplified.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So we were trying to focus on and illustrate the breadth and depth of the problem, essentially, and as well as sort of try to offer a roadmap for entities in power that want to do something about it to be able to do something about it. So what we try to do in the paper, and I won't bore you with all of it, but I think a few of the parts that I enjoyed doing most was first off just like illustrating with actual proof and screenshots how easy it is to generate hundreds of really sensitive, really specific scam texts, the types of things that you get every single day. You can do that with a degree to which it's personalized. You can make it. One of the examples we showed was spitting out 100 scam texts targeted at people with dementia. There is really sort of no end to the sort of ways in which the generative AI companies and platforms are going to try to maximize engagement, and there has not been enough sort of consequences for those companies yet. And so two things that we wanted to map out was one, sort of what I called like the scam stack, not just the generative AI companies themselves, but there are data brokers who sell lists of really specific information about people and the types of people they are that allow scammers to sort of target people with haunting precision. There are the sort of like payment platforms by which a lot of people lose money. There are ad platforms, there are entities like the social media, the email, the text, all of these people in this sort of stack of creation of a piece of content that may be used to defraud someone, to the delivery of it and the way the fraud is carried out. All of those entities can and should be held responsible in a variety of different ways. But so, then the sort of other thing is just similar to what Lana mentioned of like pouring kerosene on it. One thing I have done throughout my career is really try to illustrate the ways in which automation and AI is being used to sort of augment any sorts of occasionally good behavior, but mostly bad behavior. Whether we're talking about the use of AI in policing and facial recognition to like the generative AI things, it's all sort of the same, right? It is giving a supercharging to people that want to deceive folks, and the companies right now are offering it up with very few limitations because they don't have to have any limitations. So that was the last thing that I wanted to touch on that we really focused on, the different ways through legislative and regulatory means, as well as if the companies want to do something themselves, they can. What are some of those things that can actually be done to address this? So yeah, I will stop there. I think we'll get into a lot more, but yeah.
I also just want to say that the reports that Ben and I wrote were written absolutely in parallel to each other without, being in communication. And they came out within days of each other. I think he beat us by like 2 days. And I was terrified when I read his report or when I saw his report that it was going to totally duplicate our work. But I think they work really, really, really well and complement to each other. And I think the different perspectives, from academia and from the CFA are really complementary.
Great, thanks. And just FYI, I gave a thumbnail sketch of their bios. There is much more that I could say to praise your backgrounds and all the work that you all are doing to help protect consumers. That is all in the speaker bio portion of our website, which you can access through the QR code that is up here, as well as I believe if you received an agenda on your way in, there's a QR code on there. So feel free to check that out to learn more about our panelists. I think the concept of fraud at scale is something that I know, Ben, you talked about it in your paper. And I think, for me as thinking of as a consumer, right? I'm already being inundated every day with the toll text message that I didn't pay my toll, with the package that never got delivered, that click here to find out and what's going on with that. It feels like consumers are already being inundated with things that they have to watch out for, and AI just seems to give these scammers even more tools to make it even more sort of solicitations, as well as make them more convincing. So can you talk a little bit about how AI lowers that cost of entry for scammers?
Yeah, it makes it sort of easier, cheaper, and better to do scams. I would think sort of all of those three things are provably true. Like it is, I mentioned the one example in the report. We really go through just using the really popular platforms like ChatGPT and how quickly and how easily you can get text messages that don't have any grammatical errors. They don't have any of the sort of like red flags that everyone as consumers have started to finally, after all these years, to develop, right? If there's weird fonts or a misspelling of a word or something like that, that is often some of the things that people know are like, okay, wait, this is maybe a scam. What tools like ChatGPT provide is the ability to make sort of like plausible looking human text, English text, and a few other languages as well. But so you can just sort of like spit out plausible things, and that makes it less likely for people to to avoid it, report it, things like that. The other part of it is the scale, right? You can do, even on the commercially available, really big popular tools like ChatGPT and Gemini and Claude, you can spit out, thousands of text messages with people's names. Another example we put in it was people's names, the cities they live in, and cite a real hospital in the city they live in to try to get sort of urgency about needing money. And they would include a link to a Bitcoin wallet if you gave it to that in the ChatGPT or Anthropic chat box. And so those are the platforms that are most out there, that are most caring about PR. There are a lot of entities, and I think someone else will talk about that after, that have even less moderation to them. And so I think just simply being able to do like 1,000 personalized or personalized-ish or personalized-looking texts, that's another way in which it's expanding the fraud at scale. And then, the other part about it is that, you can pay for some premium tools, but it's free for the most part. You can create a lot of text messages. You can create a script for a robocall. You can create text. You can create a message to send through Facebook, and you can do it thousands of them in 1 second for free. So I think all of those things lowers the barrier and raises the risk for consumers.
Can I just add on that?
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to say about Ben's good kind of example about like email phishing, AI-generated email phishing text emails is like, especially when it comes to phishing emails, it's like a volume game, right? So if you can go from taking 3 minutes to craft an email to 3 minutes to craft 400 emails, and 1% of them get opened, that's like, you've really increased your effort to hit rate. And then a couple other places where AI has made fraud a lot easier. One is generating scammy websites, right? Like if you're going to do a phishing email, you need to link someone to somewhere where you're going to go collect their personal information, their banking information. It's been getting easier and easier to make a compelling website, but now it's easier than ever with AI-generated AI website building tools. And then also I think video deepfakes, like we all know people are more likely to believe something if it's coming from a trusted source. And there are people who have lost a ton of money to, videos that look like Elon Musk endorsing some investment scheme. He's one of the most commonly impersonated people, at least per New York Times investigation, people who have lost, there was one retiree who lost $690,000 in an investment scheme that, he thought Elon Musk was endorsing. So yeah, kind of every type of fraud you can think of is becoming more believable. Oh, and then also product review fraud, which we obviously care about at Consumer Reports. We do a lot of product reviews. The FTC actually brought enforcement action against Ryder, which was a company that if you put in, the name of a product, it would generate any number of reviews for that product with, details and embellishments that you didn't provide it, so fake reviews. And you might wonder, well, why would any normal person need 2,000 reviews of a roof cleaning service? And the answer is they probably don't, but maybe the person running the roof cleaning service would like that on Yelp. So kind of every kind of fraud is being supercharged by AI.
Yeah, and just to add a illustration to the kind of email question, for a long time we would separate email fraud or phishing attempts into phishing and then like harpoon whale fishing, which is like we're all the minnows, they're just fishing for us, and it's really a volume game in that sense. Like one email gets opened, you get one minnow, maybe that's a good thing. But tremendous resources were previously invested in targeting, high net worth, high profile individuals, and now that can be brought to scale. So the same techniques that were previously reserved because they were very resource and time intensive for whales is being directed at minnows because it can be automated very quickly. There was an anecdote in our report of a woman whose family got put through an extremely elaborate kind of virtual kidnapping, they call it. And I think the amount that the scammers got from them was something like $700, which previously the campaign that they ran against the family would never make that amount of money worthwhile, but now it is.
Yeah. Just the minnows versus whales thing is in the past, I think we would have considered more people to be minnows who are now turning into whales because the technology is allowing the scammers to make their pitches much more convincing and knowing things about you to target you, even if you didn't think you were, sort of a high net worth individual. I mean, an example about this, I was just having it with my colleague Mel Channing from BBB, is AI targeting patent holders. So the USPTO is a vast database of patent information, perfect for searching via AI. If you can then sort of find out who's the person who owns that patent, contact them, say there's a problem with your patent. For many people, this is their livelihoods. If I'm an owner of a patent who spent my life researching it, filing the patent, getting the revenue from it, I'm going to open that email. So I think that's a perfect example of how people who may not have thought of as sort of the big targets for these scammers, the CEOs, can also now be targeted thanks to this technology. Grace, your research into voice cloning, I think, gets at a fear that millions of consumers have, right? It's that call in the middle of the night from a loved one saying something terrible has happened and I need your help. We know that scammers have been, we've called it the grandparent scam for forever, have been engaging in this long before AI sort of came on the scene. But now this has really changed the playbook, right? And I'm thinking of, in my own life, I have a 21-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old daughter. They've put video of themselves on Instagram and TikTok and Snap, and that data's out there. The raw material to make a convincing sounding voice cloning fake to target me is out there, as I'm sure it is for millions of other consumers. Can you talk about, from your research, what were you hearing from the people who were affected here? Like, what's their experience in this? Is it really as convincing and hard to resist as I think it might be?
Sure. Well, and we also reached out to, so Consumer Reports has 5 million members across the country. We reached out to our members about this question because there have been lots of good reported stories in publications, but we suspected, this might be more widespread, and heard from a lot of members about being on the receiving end of phone calls where to them it really sounded like, their grandchild, their niece or nephew, their kid was, they had got into a car crash, they were in jail, they need money for a lawyer. And granted, part of the reason it's hard to quantify AI voice cloning scams is when you're on the receiving end, you don't know exactly what was used. And you're if you think you're hearing from a loved one in distress, you're not in your best mind to assess, the exact nature of the voice you're hearing. But for our members, these were really terrifying experiences, even if they didn't ultimately fall for the scam. In a lot of cases, they are able to figure out, oh, wait, I know my loved one wouldn't be. We had a really funny one from a grandma in New York who was like, my grandchild would never be in New Jersey. He's New York born and raised, and I knew it was a scam. But even in cases where they didn't ultimately fall for it, they were shaken for a very long time. Sorry, I'm just trying to think about what your question was. Oh, impact on real people.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then, in some cases, there have been these huge reported monetary losses. I already mentioned the retiree who lost $690,000. There was another person who lost $10,000 to an Elon Musk deepfake video scam. So people, really having their life savings wiped out in some cases.
Yeah. And I think, oh, sorry, Ben, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think there is this harder to articulate and quantify, problem where you don't want to live in a world where you're scrolling your email or Instagram and you're like, okay, I'm gonna try to be a detective and see if this is AI generated to see if I'm being screwed. And AI use is being sort of legitimized through a lot of sources and entities that we have to sort of engage with anyway. And so I think that that is the individual harm, the money lost, the sort of emotional damage is there. But there is also this sort of ongoing damage to trust and trust in the information ecosystem and sort of, whether it's voice or video or text. I sort of, that is something that keeps me up at night for sure.
Yeah, and if I can just add one more thing to that, I think, the knee-jerk reaction when you're talking about your daughters being on Snapchat and Instagram is like, whoa, maybe we should all not be on those things. But that is just not an option. I have a research project now ongoing with small business owners, and almost all of them report that they are obliged to use social media, particularly Instagram, for their business. And the only way that they can get the algorithm to show their content to their followers is by putting their face on it and doing reels where they're directly addressing the camera. And then in many cases, there are reports where that exact content is being used to fully spoof small business owner accounts. So I think we have to really understand that, opting out is not an option.
Can I say one more thing to build on that? So I think this is, in a lot of these AI scams, the sort of individual responsibility route is very unrealistic. First, for the reason you just mentioned, and the other type of harm mitigation strategy we sometimes hear about, especially with companies that are creating generative AI technologies that can be used for deepfakes, is we'll also put out a tool that you can run media through and kind of gauge the likelihood that it's AI generated, which if you aren't under any time pressure, if you're thinking in your most rational mind, maybe you'll be like, oh, could this be AI generated? Let me Google around, find a couple companies' AI detection websites and run this clip through. But if you're on the receiving end of a voice call and you think it's your grandchild, you're not going to be like, what was the 11 Labs URL for double checking if this is AI generated? So I think that there's a lot, public awareness about scams is always good, but there's a lot of ways in which individual responsibility is not really as sufficient.
And if you don't mind us keep riffing on what each other is saying, I think it's also really important to remember that we are all vulnerable. This isn't just the elderly. This isn't just people who are not tech savvy. There is recent data showing that young people are, in fact, more vulnerable to scams than older generations. In part, that's because they spend so much more time online and all of their communications are mediated through channels that are vulnerable to scamming. But I do want to share an anecdote, which is about 7 years ago when shortly after returning home from the hospital after giving birth to my daughter, I had a very long labor, emergency C-section, a very stressful time, hadn't slept for days, got home, was laying on the couch with my newborn baby, and I got a text. And the text said, you have just placed a very large charge on your card, which is true. I had just paid for the whole hospital bill with my credit card because I want those points, right? And I was like, oh yeah, true. And then they're like, can you just confirm your card number? I confirm my card number. Can you confirm your social security number? And then I thought, no, wait a minute. I study financial technology. I study social media. This is my job. And if the person who called me was a very nice representative who seemed to be a much more realistic person, I guarantee I would have given them my social security number.
Ben, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I think I will probably touch on the ways to address it, but yeah, that's a crazy status quo to live in. And I research this stuff for a living, and even if I want to, I don't want to and couldn't try to verify everything. I think that this is why we have regulatory agencies. This is why we have legislative bodies. They need to be doing more. There's 50 state AGs, 51, with sitting right here in DC. There's the Federal Trade Commission. There's Federal Communications Commission. There is a lot of different entities that can be doing, and should be doing a lot more. That is currently at this moment being rolled back. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was a massive way people would be able to find recourse and resources when they have a negative sort of scam experience. So, this conversation about individual responsibility is important and true, and this is why we have systems in place to do that. So I think, to the extent people are worried about it, and the thing that I say when people are saying, reporters or something ask, what can consumers do? Tell their elected representatives that they really care about this is probably one of the higher impact things you can do. Because right now it's a terrible status quo, but individual people can do very little to address that.
Well, let me drill down to that a little bit. In the past, we kind of had a sense about how much, how many fraudulent solicitations we were getting, right? We kind of knew how many robocalls we were getting every day and how annoying that was, how many scam texts we were getting, but we don't always know that sort of the text we're getting that might be scammy, we're not sure. The call we got that sounds like it could be somebody we know, it is maybe an impersonation scam. The email we got, that those had AI as part of the stack that led to me getting that solicitation and potentially getting defrauded. So, this gets to, I think, a larger problem. When we started thinking about doing today's conference, right? The way it kind of came together is, a few years ago I started, when ChatGPT first hit the marketplace, I started getting calls from folks in the media saying like, hey, have you thought about, how this technology is going to be used for fraud? And I said, okay, well, I think I do. If I was thinking like a scammer, this is all the ways I would try and use it. About a year later, so last year, I started saying, this is how it's actually happening in terms of anecdotes, because we started seeing all of the stories popping up in the news about consumers getting defrauded. But now we're at the sort of the place where it's like, all right, well, what do we do about this? And the what do we do about this, at least here in Washington, often relies on having good data, right? On scope, on scale, on losses. And that seems to be still a missing piece here. How do we quantify, I guess, the scope and scale of this problem? Are there researchers out there who are looking at this? Have you seen data that sort of tries to quantify this? Or is that sort of one that you were talking about, teeing up unanswered questions in your report, Lana? Like, is that something that's still a challenge? And maybe if you have ideas on how we could address that, it'd be great to hear. That's for the whole panel.
It's way, way, way underreported, and the scale is probably much larger than we know. Number one, there's not number one, but first, there's a tremendous shame associated with being scammed, particularly younger people, and particularly for kind of small amounts of money. And I think we really need to destigmatize the process of, the fact of being victimized by scams. And then create better avenues for reporting. Like I don't think I didn't report my scam, not because of shame, but because I was caught in a moment where I was harried and I froze my credit, but that's about it. And I didn't know where to report. And now the landscape of reporting has, as you point out, gotten much more sparse. Also, in terms of whether or not scams are being used by AI is being used with scams, we don't really know. I mean, I get papers from undergrads all the time that may or may not have been assisted by AI, and that same level of discernment applies for all uses of AI. There's really, really, really good reporting out there on the kind of landscape of scam compounds, largely in Myanmar, but also located, elsewhere across the world, that show the industrial scale of scam operations. The Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project has a fantastic series. The Economist has an amazing podcast. There's another podcast that's, I think, by Wondery that's called Scam Factory. And then there's a new book called Scam that are incredible and illustrate the scale of what's happening. But we really lack good research on how that's being experienced on the consumer side.
I think a few things come to mind with the reporting question. One is that, like, even in a perfect world, and there are really good resources and methods by which people can report scams, the Federal Trade Commission, the FBI, your local police department, whatever it is. There's a lot of ways in which, if you are an iPhone user and you get a text from a number you've never seen before, you can click report junk. That doesn't necessarily go to those FBI or FTC databases. One thing that sort of drove me crazy in doing my report is the sources of data and where they overlap and where they don't overlap, right? The FBI, for example, in their cybercrime report for 2024, was $16 billion in losses, which was a 33% increase over the year before. So that sort of leads me to the second point is it's kind of impossible to be able to flag, okay, there is, a 33% increase and 18% of those are attributable to the use of AI. Because literally, if you imagine it, if you are getting to the point where you are reporting, which most people are not, do you think you would have like a checkbox that's like, I think this may be AI. Does that like matter, right? Or you're addressing the sort of methods by which these scams can be done, and you're addressing the method of distribution and whatnot. And so I think that it is almost impossible to know, but the more people talk about it and the more people think about it, the more people talk about it and the more people think about it, right? Like in the literal reporting, like journalism sense, there's also, there have been, that's why we know about a lot of these things, right? There's the one-offs, this grandmother lost $18,000 because they had a deepfake scam, something to that effect. The more stuff that is written about that and talked about and normalized, the more stuff will be talked about, and there will be sort of some reduced shame and probably increased ability to do that. I think the other part of it is that the platforms, as I mentioned, if you get a scam through Facebook or if you get a scam through your text messages, even if you, find the little 3 dots somewhere and do the report thing, it is probably going to help improve their fraud detection algorithms to make it less likely they deliver content like that to you or other people in the future. And that's like the best case scenario, right? It's not like those pieces of information are being forwarded on to enforcement agencies. And so, when we talk about the $16 billion number there, I think is over $5 billion of the recent FTC report, that is like not including all of those things. So there's a myriad of challenges, but there's also a lot of opportunities to increase investment in educating people how to report, why to report, ways to report, right? There are literally law enforcement things, but there are also, and I think AARP has a lot of great resources about this, talking to your family and friends about it, because that helps destigmatize it, right? My parents, I think, are really embarrassed when they're like, is this real? Like, and they send me a screenshot, and I'm always, grateful when they do, because it, can be obvious to me or sometimes, but, I think there is that sort of shame that can be addressed by putting responsibility on the platforms, giving more resources to the enforcement agencies, and trying to connect that data a little bit.
The one other thing I'll add, so I totally agree with these two about my co-panelist about, like, in most cases we have fraud numbers. They're already low quality because people don't report fraud, and then in many cases we have just like no way of knowing if AI was used. And you're totally right. Like, data does tend to spur, congressional hearings, actions, lights a fire into people sometimes. I do think another potential source of data is, a lot of agencies have investigatory authority, and looking at companies where the product can logically easily being used for fraud, using those investigation powers to peek behind the curtain a little bit. So like, I don't know the exact sequencing of the writer enforcement action that the FTC did, but part of the reason they had a pretty strong case is they discovered all the instances in which writer was being used to generate hundreds of reviews for the same product. Is that obvious from the outside? Probably not. So I think there's also a role to play here in agencies, state AGs that have investigatory powers to do some of the digging, peek behind the curtain, and generate some of that data that illustrates how these tools are being misused.
Yeah, and while the data is incomplete and necessarily incomplete, it's not like there's not enough for the enforcement agencies to be doing a little bit more. So, there's also, it's related to all the different consumer protection issues, right? Part of the reason why writer as a case was taken up was because there was a priority on cracking down on fake reviews in general. And so then there was this enforcement priority, there was enforcement resources devoted to that, and when there was an entity by which fake reviews are bombed across the internet really easily and really quickly, they were able to more confidently bring an enforcement action. So I think that like there is the general role of the deregulatory movement that is damaging not just reporting but the enforcement of it. And it's not like we are all the regulators are like, I don't know if there's any scam. It's probably fine, right? Like it's while the reporting is a problem, I think we sort of have enough information to start doing more enforcement actions.
And I'm glad you brought up the writer case. We actually, on our last panel today, if you needed a reason to stick around for the whole day, we do have Kate White from the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection who will be on our final panel, and I know that she is going to be talking about the writer decision. So definitely stick around to ask her these questions exactly.
And just as a plug, for those of you who are in the position to seek data, as someone from the academic side, be in conversation with us, reach out. We have a lot of valuable research skills and a lot of burning questions, but we do want to know more about how we can point our efforts in order to, support, broader applied efforts.
And just to, put we're piling on the need for data here. I will just say it's not like we're starting from a place where, we don't already have a big problem that we know of. The FTC last year put out a report on senior scams, and a tiny little footnote at the bottom of that report was what I thought was the headline. They estimate that only 4% of people who are victims of scams actually report it to the commission, and that if you actually extrapolate that out, the total amount of fraud losses annually in the U.S. is $158 billion. That's a big number by anybody's count, and I just think about all of the things that we could be putting that money to, but instead it's going into the pockets of some of the worst of the worst. And I really do mean that. There was an article in the New York Times just yesterday about sort of the new cartel in Mexico that's sort of taking over from Sinaloa. And one of the ways that they are making money now is running timeshare scams targeted at Americans. We know about the scam compounds in Southeast Asia. And there are other parts of the world where they specialize in particular types of scams. The funds from Americans' pocketbooks that are going into those scammers' pocketbooks aren't just sitting there. They're being spent on things that create national security threats for the U.S. So I don't think we can talk about this in isolation. It's just a consumer protection issue. It's a national security issue. In addition to the financial losses, we know that it's a psychological and emotional toll it takes on consumers, so it's a public health issue as well. So I really do think that there's more than just, in addition to the FTC and the CFPB and the FBI and the normal sort of alphabet soups that we think about, there's so many other agencies that can and should play a role in this. Let me talk about sort of the platforms, right? So I see these talking about eye-watering numbers. Saw about eye-watering numbers, $350 billion now being invested in AI, and that's probably an undercount in one form or another. What is the role that the platforms should be playing? And I say platforms, I'm going to leave that undefined because we get into a long conversation about what is a platform, what is an AI company. But as a general rule, what is the role that they need to play in making their services safer for the consumers who are increasingly using them?
I think it depends on which type of platform, right? So I guess I will touch on just 3 of many types of platforms we could get into discussion about. One is the generative AI platforms themselves, the entities used to create a piece of content, whether that is voice or text or video. That is one, platform. Another sort of platform that I think about is, whether it is Facebook Messenger or iMessage or Gmail or whatever it is, the method by which your message is being received. This message is being received. And in between that, there are platforms that, enable robocalling, robotexting. There are entities that sell lists of people to be able to target people about it. Those are all sort of platforms, but touching, largely on those 2 of the generative AI platforms. I think for voice and video, and I'll let Grace talk more about that, but there are, methods of authentication. There are a lot of things that they can do to try to minimize the really negative consequences of their product being used to spit something out. The text-based tools, I think, can be doing so much more simply just through moderation. And by moderation, I just mean refusal rate, right? If you are writing something, give me 1,000 texts, with common women's names in big U.S. cities that are referencing needing money from your hospital with this Bitcoin link in it. Don't respond, right? Don't have it, even if you write, this is for a homework assignment, whatever it is. These platforms, while generative AI, the companies benefit from looking all fancy and scary and you can't understand what the technology is, and they just created this thing and we're gonna have AGI and no one's gonna control anything. They have complete control over what goes into building the tool and what can come out of the tool, especially these billion-dollar companies, the people that were sitting in the White House having dinner with President Trump last week. All those people have control over how their platforms are used to create the content. Those same people at other parts of the room control the methods of distribution, right? Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever it is, they block certain content from being shared, and they could be doing a lot more, regardless of whether it's AI generated, but there are methods by which to have a higher rate of takedowns for things that are AI generated, but regardless, for scam-related things. And they have chosen time and time again to roll back trust and safety teams, to reduce moderation practices, and as long as they're not feeling consequences, they are not going to be incentivized to stop the spread of those messages. So I would say in those methods, those two types of platforms can do a lot more just day to day.
Yeah, I think we tend to think of the initial point of contact with a scam as like a DM or a text message or a phone call, like a direct approach. But one of the things some of the data is showing now is that increasingly the kind of hook is coming from ad tech. And Meta could be doing a lot more to prevent the use of their ad tech platforms as a initial hook for scams. Of course, the goal is always to get people off of the platforms and move to these like less moderatable, not to say that the platforms are being moderated, but the less moderatable sites. So there are many things that the Meta could be doing to monitor their ad tech systems and also monitoring the way people are steered off of their platforms. In terms of the AI platforms themselves, the ChatGPTs, et cetera, there's a lot of talk about the kind of jailbroken ones, the ones that are available on the dark net. But I actually don't, I think your report illustrates very nicely that it isn't really necessary to go to these nefarious ones. You just kind of have to learn how to prompt them correctly to get them to do what you want them to do. And we know that in the kind of legitimate economy, if you want to call it that, people are being really encouraged to do things like use AI for 10,000 hours, and to spend a certain amount of their month like really figuring out how to best use AI to do their jobs. You can bet that that's also happening in the scam industry. They are super users, and they're going to figure out the best way to use existing platforms without necessarily resorting to harder to get ones. At the same time, you don't have to go to the dark web to find the kind of more nefarious AI platforms. Again, as a professor, I think about this platform called Cluey, I think, which is explicitly designed for college students to cheat. That's what it is. It's very clear about what its purpose is. And as far as I know, that is venture funded. So we don't need to look very far to see, how AI is being used for ways that are, I guess, antisocial.
I was going to say, yeah, I would love to live in a world where people had to kind of hack together open sourced, ill-fitting tools to use AI for scams. But instead, at least right now, we're seeing like literal industry-leading products. The Biden robocall to New Hampshire voters telling them to not vote in the primary, that was 11 Labs audio. They're like very mainstream. Like, up until recently when I checked this morning, every article on the Atlantic website you could have translated by 11 Labs. So people are not having to hunt for kind of gray market, black market products.
For folks who aren't familiar with the Biden voice cloning, could you give us a thumbnail on what that is?
Yeah, voters in New Hampshire received a call that sounded very much like it was a call from Joe Biden, telling them, don't vote in the primary. I can't remember exactly what the rationale was for why they shouldn't vote, but just telling them to not vote in the primary. You can find the audio clip online. It sounds very realistic.
And the FCC actually took action there.
Yeah, so there's an investigation. I do think there's, so some of these, especially when high-profile figures are involved, there's like good media coverage, there's great investigations, and that's wonderful. I think, and then you have like AI forensic researchers who are analyzing the audio, confirming that it's AI generated, even being able to pin down with some degree of confidence what company the audio came from. You don't have that kind of response when it's just like a normal consumer being ripped off.
And I believe one of the interesting things to come out of that case is that when the FCC brought their case their enforcement action, they actually didn't base their enforcement action on the fact that they were using AI to defraud, to try and mislead consumers. They based it on the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which is the same law they use to go after sort of fraudulent telemarketers, right, for using an automated dialing service to do this. So interesting how sort of like old school laws, or to me at least, are being used, because CCPA has been around for 40 years at this point, how they're being used in this new environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an ongoing discussion, and a lot of my work ends up trying to be passing new legislation in both states and federal level on AI-specific harms. But ask any federal government agency, ask any state government agency, all the laws still apply when AI is used, right? The prior administration, there was a series of 11 agencies that put out a statement saying explicitly that. It's been said over and over again, and it's true. If you break the law, I think one of the sort of lines from the CFPB a lot last administration was that there's no like fancy technology exception to breaking the law. So whether that is the TCPA, whether that is just unfair deceptive trade practice law, whether that is sort of the Equal Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, things like that. There are a lot of laws by which AI is used to violate the law, and of course that is what should be used, right? So it almost doesn't matter. It matters because it's making it worse. It's making it harder to track. It's making it harder to uncover. But it almost doesn't matter that it's AI. It's the underlying action you're using AI to do.
Could I just jump in with something I didn't respond to your previous question about, what should AI platforms be doing? And I thought about this a lot in the context of the voice cloning paper. And I would argue that those companies are offering products, not platforms. But I do think there's a lot more that they could be doing. I think it's worth thinking about, whatever a company is marketing its product for. It's often marketing its product for pro-social use cases, although certainly there are some companies that are like, we do scams, let us help you scam. And those are very obvious enforcement targets. But, in a lot of cases, companies in the AI voice cloning space, the use cases they're marketing their products for are like speeding audio narration, speeding audio editing, voice-to-voice language translation, movie dubbing. Great. A lot of those are business-to-business applications. And so does that necessitate a direct-to-consumer model where you can get your account up and running in 30 seconds, all you need is a name and an email, and it's free? Not necessarily. And I think it's important for companies to be feeling like, from a potential liability perspective, if we aren't taking like very reasonable steps that actually don't dramatically impact our ability to offer the use case that we say we're trying to offer, there might be legal repercussions. And especially, we've seen some FTC enforcement cases where the part of the basis of the enforcement action is like there were obvious steps you could take and you didn't take them and therefore you are liable. And I think especially in the context of the voice cloning landscape where you have many different business models, including business models that are kind of like you can only clone a voice by meeting with a representative from the company and like signing some contracts about what happens to the model and who has access to it. And it's like a supervised voice cloning experience, which makes a lot of sense if you have a B2B use case, because if you're like hiring Scarlett Johansson to use her voice to do like personalized ad targeting, there's a lot of people in that business deal who don't want that voice model to be abused. Anyway, all this to say, when you see a variety of business models, and some of them are very protective and others are really a free-for-all, and they're marketing towards the same use cases, I think it should really raise questions about, reasonable safeguards.
And I think, Grace, you raise a really good point, which is that at the end of the day, AI is a tool, right? It can be used for good and bad. Voice cloning, as you just pointed out, is a tool that has very benign and useful use cases. So do most of the platforms we've been talking about today. I use them all the time for not scamming people. And so I guess, one of the tensions that, I think it's important to explore, and I hope we're going to explore on the following panel that Aurelian is going to moderate, is how do we allow AI to continue to flourish, for the benefits to continue to flow, while at the same time not allowing technology to run amok and be used to defraud consumers, right? How do we get the benefits and avoid some of those costs? Is that possible? Is it a false dichotomy for me to suggest that there has to be that tension there for us to address? How do we make sure that we allow innovation in this space, which I think is helping us, is helping millions of consumers, and it has the potential to help millions more in the healthcare space and many other uses, right? Can we allow those to go forward and those benefits to flow without having to also incur the costs of the fraud that we've been talking about today? And how do we do that?
I don't think that there's any world in which we don't reap the benefits of AI, right? There's no world in which we just are like, oh gosh, there's so many scams, better stop doing AI. Like, that's not going to happen. So most of our focus needs to be on thinking about the safeguards, and also thinking about how the safeguards, impact consumers. So there are many. This is kind of an exciting time because we're writing rules, or hopefully we'll be writing rules. And so we really need to think through those rules and think through the impacts of those rules for companies, yes, but also for how they have surprising knock-on effects for consumers.
I would also just add, there are tons of polling about consumer sentiment on AI right now. And in a lot of the results, trust is not high. People are very skeptical. They are very freaked out. They're worried about coming for their jobs. They're worried about their teenagers using it and becoming reliant on it or deciding to kill themselves. All of these kind of terrifying potential impacts that are being reported out. And I think for AI to become most productive and for us to reap the benefits the most, there needs to be strong enforcement and rules of the road so that it becomes a reliable product that people are not so freaked out by.
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer the question about whether it's a false dichotomy, it is, but it is a pervasive false dichotomy that you hear every single day on the Hill and every single day by enforcement agencies. It is, the companies, the Sam Altmans of the world, their line is essentially, if you regulate us in a common sense way, require us to test our platforms, and maybe wait a few weeks before we, cash in on our newest model, if you try to require some authentication, if you require a sort of duty of responsibility to moderate, then all of AI is gone, the internet is broken, and we all have to go home. It is this false dichotomy that is set up when in reality, good regulation would increase innovation. It would increase the positive effects of AI because it gives sort of clear rules of the road. We've had for years, this has been the case in privacy for 25 years, breaking the law is just the cost of doing business. It doesn't matter. The Facebooks of the world, the OpenAIs of the world, they can break the law, they can do whatever they want with their platform, and the smaller companies can't really necessarily do that all the time. So I think that is actually good regulation would not necessarily ever just try to end up reducing the positive effects of AI. And, I don't think any law that would necessarily do that would pass sort of First Amendment muster, would end up necessarily being the case. So if some bad companies or some venture capitalists that invest in a lot of companies that do things that are both good and bad end up losing a little bit of money because of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the individuals and society as a whole are having less of the impact, the positive potential impacts of the use of automated systems. So I think that it's a tough and pervasive false dichotomy. If folks watch the hearing tomorrow at 10 a.m. in House Judiciary, you'll hear all about how AI regulation is going to ruin everything. And hopefully the lawmakers will be able to see through that.
So Ben, I'm going to let's have a little real talk on this, right? If folks aren't aware, we are one of, I think, at least 3 conferences happening in DC this week talking about AI policy in some form or another. And the other 2, which I'm not going to name, they're
not as good.
They're not as good as this one, trust me.
Got the right one.
The theme is from the White House, from folks in the White House, less regulation, good. Mm-hmm. Only way for us to keep up with China. Yeah. Good for the economy. Let's get any of these sort of little regulations around consumer protection, around all the things that Biden did, to try and sort of slow this down a little bit, make it safer. We're doing a 180 on those. Little thousand flowers bloom. So my prediction here is that we're going to see very little new appetite for regulation in this space for at least the next 3 years. So if you agree with that, and feel free to push back, please push back on that. I need you to push back on that. Where should we be looking for places where the kind of guardrails that I think you're all talking about to come from? Or are we in a place where we basically just have to strap in and hope that at some point down the road we'll have a regulatory environment that's more conducive to this?
So I think from the federal level in the executive branch right now, I'm not super hopeful that we are going to see a lot of movement and sort of pivot turn to embracing lots of good regulatory approaches that are holding companies accountable. Although I think we will continue to see that, right? It is there is a lot of defanging and efforts to reduce the capabilities of places like the Federal Trade Commission, and they are still doing some enforcement action. So I think that like piecemeal, we will see some federal executive branch action, but at the same time, the White House is doing a lot to try to obtain more investment in these AI companies. They are facilitating the use of federal lands for data centers so that the companies don't have to invest so much in it. They are brokering a deal with Saudi Arabia to invest $20 billion in American AI companies to just invest in American AI companies. Lord knows what we're giving up in that one. But there are a lot of different entities from the executive branch. I think where we could, I can go on for the parade of horrors for that for a long time. But I think where we can see and may see is, I think, I won't hold my breath for watching Congress to do something, but I think this is a bipartisan-ish issue, right? Everyone has people, every congressperson has people in their district complaining about scams. They have it themselves. This is an issue that people from across the aisle are interested in trying to solve. If they are willing to do so in a way that might upset the tech companies is a different question, but I do think that we're seeing more and more hearings and bill drafts and whatnot circulating around Congress. But I would say where we are going to see a lot, and already seeing a lot, is in the states. There are sort of state efforts to legislate AI, but I would honestly point mostly to state AGs, where I think a lot of this can be done. Especially pinning holes in different parts of that sort of scam stack, as I talked about, trying to investigate and hold data brokers accountable for selling lists of people of elderly people that might be really good to scam is essentially the list that they sell almost verbatim. There is, sort of a lot of different ways in which the AG offices, as well as the state legislators and local legislators, can sort of do to try to set up some rules of the road. So I think, yeah, that's what we're seeing.
And Grace, I'll come to you in just one second. I just want to remind the audience, we will have time for a Q&A at the end of this presentation. So if you have questions that you want to ask, start thinking of them now. We have two folks in the back who have mics who will come running your way if you raise your hand. So I'm going to go to Grace, and then we'll go to Q&A.
I was just going to build on Ben and what Ben said about the states, and Ben and I both work on state regulatory efforts arm in arm very often. But I think in addition to states, so there's a lot of state legislators that are very motivated to work on this issue that feel like they missed the boat on social media and do not want to miss the boat on AI. So there's a lot of motivation there to do it, to not wait too long, but to get it right. So I'm really impressed by that vigor, and I think we will continue. We've already seen some good pieces of AI legislation pass, and I think we will continue to see that. Also, state attorney generals, especially in states with unfairness authority in their state UDAP statutes, can actually do a lot. And this is really a bipartisan issue, as illustrated by the fact that some of the I haven't been following every AI UDAP case brought by state AGs, but a couple prominent ones have been brought by Ken Paxton in Texas. So this, scammy AI companies lying about what their products can do, I don't think is a partisan issue.
If only there was an AI that could help you track all the AI cases that are out there. That'd be great.
I'm sure that exists. AI Gov affairs. We've seen that in the buses on DC.
Right. Okay, so again, if you have questions for our colleagues here, I'd ask that you raise your hand, and we'll have folks run a mic to you. If you could just identify yourself when you ask your question, and then if you can, make sure it's a question.
Yeah, hey, thanks everybody. So, now that we have centralized AI companies, how do you all see the decentralized AI companies? How do you think those plan to integrate and become regulated at any point? And can they be regulated?
And I'm sorry, could you just identify yourself?
Oh, my name's Lawrence Easlip.
Great, thanks.
I mean, I think it depends on how the regulation in question is sort of written. I think, there would be a few approaches that would just really target the absolutely massive Meta, Google, whatevers of the world, like 5 or 6 companies, and require them to do things. This is what we saw with things like the RAISE Act, with the 1047 in California. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but it is only applying to those really big, large, decentralized or centralized companies. I think that functionally, what is probably more of a workable approach is to regulate or legislate the sort of function itself, right? Like if you are talking about tools that can create things that sound like people's voices, I think regardless of whether you're a 5-person company or you are, working for Sam Altman, I think you should be regulated similarly. And so I think it depends on, your action, depends on the jurisdiction you're in. But I think that, the thing that matters is the action that the companies are taking. So, yeah.
I think it's important to think clearly about what we're talking about when we're talking about AI. So there's the models, then there's the technology, of which there are only a few, and then there's the technology that sit between you and the models, and then there's the actual interface that you're accessing all of that through. And there's other parts to that stack as well, but to just kind of paint in broad strokes. And I think that we can think about each layer of that stack as a potential point of intervention.
Yeah, I'm curious what you meant by decentralized versus centralized AI companies, but if you mean just the big companies versus small, do you mean the big companies versus startups, or?
Yeah, just like a whole network of people contributing.
I mean, things do get trickier, especially outside of where the U.S. law reaches. And this is something that came up. We were thinking about this also in the AI voice cloning paper, because one thing you hear about, we shouldn't attempt to hold some of these U.S. companies accountable, or we shouldn't attempt to regulate because A, there'll be open source models, and B, other countries can make even state endorsed model, whatever. There's so many ways that it could be hard for U.S. law to fully reach, but I don't find that to be a very compelling reason to not even try. I think it's important to set a reasonable standard where U.S. law can easily reach, and then also just the question about open source and when is it reasonable to make a project open source. Even a company deciding to make a project open source, that decision I think could be held up to Section 5 FTC scrutiny, and maybe there are certain types of products that are not reasonable to open source.
Thank you. Other questions? I think we had one back here, and then we'll come to you here in the front.
Good morning. My name is Maurice Turner. We started the conversation talking about how technology is getting faster, cheaper, and better. And so I wanted to know, from your perspective, are you seeing that adoption by the technology coming from existing scammers, the ones that are in it for the higher volumes and see it more as a corporation, like with the cartel example, or are you seeing it actually growing the base of the smaller scammers, so actually getting more people into scamming? And I'm asking the question because I'm thinking about enforcement. So if enforcement action is going to be targeted, and there are obviously going to be limited resources, time, money, political will, is it going to be better to go after those larger scammers, or is it going to be better to go after the smaller scammers to discourage new people from joining this industry?
I can start there. I mean, I think one thing is that I don't necessarily know if the tools are getting better and faster, easier, within the time period of once they're offering. I just mean that it's making scamming better and easier and faster. I think to answer your question more directly, it's I think that's why in the FTC example, and a lot of state UDAPs could do the same, really targeting the means and instrumentalities of that scam, right? I think that going after the entity that allows you to create, that was the whole concept behind the Writer case, is not that they were posting fake Amazon reviews. They were sort of giving the weapon for scammers to be able to do that at scale. And so I think that it's like a really hard question to answer about whether these tools are being used more by smaller scammers or bigger scammers, and it's really hard to track, even though I'd love if we could. But I think that's why it's even more important to go after the sort of mechanism by which anybody could use it, small scammers, big scammers. And so, I hope that gets taken up. I know the current FTC chairman is not a fan of the concept of means and instrumentalities, which is a funny thing to say, but I think it is a alive and well concept that is probably like the way I would recommend enforcement agencies go after it. Then try to do the whack-a-mole of, you did all these scams and you may have used AI to do it, going after the provider. I mean, it's both and, right? But with the reality of the extremely limited resources, as you mentioned.
Great. And we'll have the last question right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Kendra. I'm a student at American University. You guys mentioned that there was a 4% of victims of scams report them to the commission, and so I was wondering if these victims are more likely to report these scams to banks, and if there is opportunity for collaboration between banks and the commission, and if there are any data privacy laws that might create implications or make this more difficult.
Sure, I can jump in on this one. Your answer to your question, the FTC isn't the only place that people report scams. They absolutely do go to their banks and to other entities. And the FTC or other regulators might not even be their first or second or even third stop on that. So I think your point gets to something we'll be talking about on our last panel of the day, which is the need for better information sharing, right? There are so many different entities in this fraud chain who are receiving signals, whether about fraud, just AI-powered or not, who could be sharing that information and doing it better. And so we'll be talking in the last panel about this Aspen Institute effort, the National Policy for Frauds and Scams, that's getting at that issue exactly. Because I think you're identifying a good one, which is that there is a lack of coordination among all the different actors who have signals about these scams. And attacking that problem is one way to try and get at all fraud, but especially at this coming wave of AI-powered fraud.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that I think you hit the nail on the head with the question about the privacy aspect of it. This is something I struggle with a lot in terms of advocating for like social media platforms, for example, to be able to provide resources to like auto report to the entities, the regulators, for example. And obviously there are some privacy protections that need to be taken in order to do that without exacerbating the problem. I think there's also like the sort of inherent privacy concern with reporting in general, right? You just got scammed, and part of the reason was because you like put your information in a place you didn't necessarily think, maybe you shouldn't have, and then you go on to the website to type your information. You have to put in, your contact information or whatever to report it even. So I think there's like all sorts of interesting incentives, but I do think that especially for the bigger agencies, the entities that provide, sort of high-level stats about it, there are a lot of ways that are privacy protective to sort of automatically ensure that more is getting counted and we're not sitting with that 4% estimation.
Just a tiny thing, which is that people report fraud to their banks because their banks will do something about them. So, credit cards have a pretty good mechanism for chargebacks, and it works most of the time. People are not reporting to platforms or agencies when there's no next step.
Yeah, I was going to say, compared to other alternative payment platforms, banks are pretty good. They're pretty regulated. They try pretty hard to prevent fraud, and then they have consumer safeguards when you do get defrauded. And that's why, pretty often scammers are saying like, pay me on this, on Cash App, pay me in Bitcoin. But I think two other thoughts on banks. One, this came up a lot actually when we talked to our members about AI voice cloning fraud or like impersonation fraud. And in a handful of cases, they were deceived, went to their bank to try and make a withdrawal, and the human teller was like, this is a scam, and persuaded them not to do it. And so that's just like old school fraud detection that's still working. So that's great. And the other thing I'll say is, there was a wave of banks implementing like voice ID software. So like you'd call to check your balance or something like that, and you'd repeat some sentence like, my voice is my password, and then it'd be like, okay, like you're in your bank account, like we know you have a unique voice. Now journalists, I think like a journalist from Motherboard made a voice clone of their own voice and then was able to use that clone to get into their bank account. So I think and hope and believe that banks know about voice cloning now and are hopefully taking that into account in their like multi-factor authentication. But those are just a few points related to banks and fraud detection that I think are relevant.
Fantastic. Well, I'm afraid we don't have any more time for questions, but if y'all are willing to stick around, I think you may get some folks who come up to you afterwards. Could I ask we all get a big hand? Grace, Lana, Ben, thank you for being part of this.